Hello and welcome to Wellness TV. My name is Kimberly Haas. Today we are continuing our mini-series within our larger series. We will continue to talk about heroin abuse and its impact on the Derry community. I'm joined by Captain Vern Thomas of the Derry Police Department. Thank you so much for joining us on this show today, Captain.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
It's very important to our audience at home that they understand all of the aspects of heroin misuse and abuse in our area. And I wanted to talk to you about what you're seeing on your side when it comes to law enforcement and how heroin and other opiate addiction has affected the greater Derry community.
Yeah, absolutely. Heroin really is an epidemic in southern New Hampshire and probably throughout the state as well. We certainly have our share happening in Derry. One of the aspects of things that doesn't get often talked about is who other victims may be in this regard. Often they talk about the abuser of the heroin being a victim of his own or her own actions, but there are also victims that are on the periphery of that, and it's not only the family of the abuser but also the community at large.
And it impacts, neighbors, it impacts businesses, it impacts a larger group than just that one individual. So if I understand correctly, that's going to be our focus today.
That's something that we should absolutely talk about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I know you have a great PowerPoint presentation. You always come well prepared with your PowerPoint presentation, and everybody at home will be able to follow along. I know you want to first talk about the victims, and like you said, in a larger sense, in a community sense.
Absolutely. We're entitled the PowerPoint today, Heroin Abuse Victims and Community Impact. And I would like to go through the slides and just discuss a little bit about each aspect. When we talk about victims of heroin abuse, you see in the slide that they're often considered victims if they're the persons abusing the drugs because they're struggling with addiction. They need help of some sort that may or may not be available locally. And often I hear the remark, they need treatment, not incarceration. And we hear that more because we're the people that tend to put people in jail. And that's a great remark, but there's a lot more to it than the simple statement, and that's what we'll explore today. Who are the other victims of abuse? From the perspective of law enforcement, we get to see the people who are family, parents, siblings, children of the abuser. They are very much affected, and we'll talk about that in a moment, just how they are, and the community at large who are victims of crime that may be associated with the abuse of heroin. When we talk about family, sometimes they're the first to know, as the slide says, or maybe they're the last ones to know. A lot of people who are abusing drugs will try to hide that from their family. Once they're addicted, they don't want the family to know that they have issues, and it doesn't serve them well if they're going to be doing things in the household to have other people know about it, so they do try to hide. Or the family may be the first ones to know. They notice the behavior is different of the abuser, and they're not quite sure why that is. They blame relationships or employment status or things like that, and it may actually be abuse of opiate drugs that's the problem. From the family perspective, they don't necessarily know how to help when they do find out that a person's addicted. It's probably new to the family. They have no idea where to go, who to turn to, who to ask questions of. There's a financial impact that's there too, where the individual may be taking things from the household, maybe draining bank accounts that the family needs to support the family with and pay their bills. Then there's a loss of trust as well between the people who are the immediate family members and this person who's their household member and their loved one who is now doing things that are against the family. Some cases of those that we've seen are the abuser takes the child's Xbox game and goes and pawns it, or takes the car and does certain things with that. A number of different things. And what ends up happening at some point is the family doesn't trust that person in the house anymore, doesn't trust to have belongings in the house anymore, and it creates a lot of turmoil for the family, in addition to the fact that this individual is addicted to drugs. Now they have different challenges. And the emotional impact, and that for their family, an emotional impact many times is the person they've overdosed, and the family has to worry about, is this person going to survive? Or they disappear for an extended period of time and no one knows where they are, and the family's concerned and they don't know where to look, they don't know where to turn for help on that. There's a lot of aspects to that are all emotional aspects of it. It's very wearing on the family.
There's also, too, from my understanding, within the cycle of abuse, the actual abuse of the family members, that once a person becomes addicted, then they're only nice when they're getting something from the family members. When they're not getting what they want, whether it be money or access to other things so they can pawn them or whatever it is to sell them for more drugs, they become quite abusive towards their family members, and that's oftentimes why people will take off for a couple days and things like that. Is that a true statement in your
Absolutely
opinion?
true. Absolutely true. We've gone to many calls where there's domestic disputes, and this is the foundation of it, was money for drugs, or the addict took money that was intended for paying a bill or something, and that's what precipitates an argument, and then sometimes it turns physical. And as a person who is addicted is starting to wear off and needs another fix, so-called, they become very aggressive. They will do anything and they will say anything. That's been our experience. So that can lead to family violence as well. Mm. There's an additional impact is for the community at large with addicted people. There's criminal activity that includes burglaries, robberies, and those kinds of things. Neighborhoods feel less safe when a number of crimes have occurred in their neighborhood. And the person who's addicted may use their own neighborhood as the first place that they might commit a crime to maybe get money for drugs. So neighborhoods become unsafe, or the people feel they're unsafe. And then another part that's not really looked at often, but really is something that should be, is the uncompensated emergency medical care. A person who overdoses gets a big response from law enforcement, paramedics, fire department responding, everybody trying to save the individual's life. And that's an expensive proposition for people. It's the right thing for us to do, but it does put a burden on the hospital. It puts a burden on law enforcement. Puts a burden on the medical response. And it's uncompensated. So there's certainly a drain there as well. And the addicted person isn't thinking about that. I'm sure they're not. They have other issues that they're trying to address, but it certainly is a community impact. I brought some statistics from the Derry community that I think are pretty relevant. We talk about heroin-involved investigations, and what does that mean? Heroin-involved investigations are things that have a foundation in the abuse of a heroin drug. It could be the domestic dispute that leads to an assault. It could be a criminal investigation regarding a sale or possession of heroin. But as you look at this, you see that in 2010 we had 54 cases that were related to heroin. 2011 we had 57 cases. And it was in 2012 that we saw the spike in heroin abuse and the prevalence of that issue for us in Derry. And we had 90 cases. 2013, 132 cases. And here we are, and these statistics are as of the end of June, this being July. We have 114 cases so far this year already that are heroin-involved investigations. So it's clearly this is an epidemic situation, and it's getting much worse.
Now, what do you think contributed to that spike, Captain Thomas, when you're talking about the difference between 2011 and 2012? Was it the way that you were investigating and the things that you were looking for, or was there actually an increase in heroin use in the area?
We saw a shift from the prescription drugs, opiate drugs, to actual use of heroin. That was a real transition. We saw it take place. Heroin purity and availability was greater. The cost of it was less than the pills. And people transitioned, from what we can tell, from the prescription meds to the actual heroin. So that's the big spike, and it happened in a very short period of time. And it was about 2012, the end of 11, the beginning of 12, that took place.
And the statistics from the medical examiner's office when it comes to overdose too on heroin and stuff are very similar to these numbers. It's about that same time period that people shifted from the oxycodone and other opiate drugs to heroin.
That's true. I've seen those statistics, and they are consistent with our observations in Derry.
Okay.
So let's talk about the criminal activity that is involved with heroin abuse and its impact here. Mainly it's property crimes. They include burglaries, robbery, theft, forgeries, credit cards. The burglaries, breaking into people's homes to take things, whether it's money and jewelry, electronics, those are the kinds of things that tend to disappear. Or more recently with burglaries, we've found that people are breaking into homes that are unoccupied and they're for sale, and they're stealing all of the copper plumbing out and trying to sell that as scrap. There's a demand for scrap copper, and that's been successful for the people that are committing the burglaries. Quite a few of these burglaries get solved when we catch one addict that's willing to talk to us and ultimately confesses to the crime. And those are the kind of crime that they're committing. The robberies are more either a rip-off of a person who is selling drugs for either the drugs that they have in their possession or for the proceeds for the drugs that they sold. That seems to have increased. Thefts associated with drug use have been significant in terms of breaking into cars, things like that. That's happened quite a lot. You know, we encourage people to keep their doors and windows locked on their vehicles in their homes. In the last many months, we've had complaints of people actually smashing windows out of secured vehicles to get to the property that may be inside. In some cases, there's nothing inside the vehicle, but the crime has occurred anyway. The forgeries are typically involving checks that belong to family members or close friends, where someone has been trusted to get close enough to personal belongings like checkbooks and so forth, and a check or two disappears out of the book. Next thing you know, it's been forged. And with the way that surveillance has worked out for many of the banks and retail outlets and things, that's really ramped up quite a lot. There's a lot of cameras out there. We end up finding the person that did that pretty readily, and then we trace it back to how they were able to acquire the check. And credit card fraud, someone taking a credit card or a debit card and using that to draw out sums of cash to buy drugs with. That's quite a lot.
Let's talk for just a second about some of these particular crimes, particularly burglary. When you mentioned the copper in the houses, now that's something that prior to the show you explained to me is an unregulated market, so it's much easier to unload that copper than it is to, say, unload a gold chain at a pawn shop. Very
true. Most cities and towns in New Hampshire have come up with ordinances that follow pretty much the state law regarding pawned items. And the items that are required to be tracked in a pawn are usually jewelry, electronics, expensive items that are marketable. When it comes to things like scrap metal, that's not tracked. The people that handle the scrap metal are not required to follow any specific regulations that would help us track a person that's turning in large quantities of copper or other precious metal as junk. As a result, it's been a marketable thing for people to go out and cut copper out of a house, because you can't necessarily track that pipe back to where it came from. And then we find this in salvage yards. And we ask the question, do you know who pawned this or who turned this in? And this isn't a pawn shop, buddy, is the answer that we get.
Right.
And very true. It's not regulated, and it's been successful for the people that are doing that.
Now, in my work at Foster's Daily Democrat, I have noticed that a lot of the robberies related to drugs are instances where typically somebody will go into an apartment or a house of someone they know, and a lot of times they're armed. Are you seeing a lot of armed robberies here, like with guns, or is it more just threatening?
We've had a couple of instances where someone's actually entered a home with a firearm. We haven't had as many of the so-called home invasions that have been reported to us. That doesn't mean that they don't happen, because as I said earlier, the type of crime that we're talking about is a person who may be selling drugs and they have proceeds or they have the actual drugs to be sold, and that's a person that may not want to come forward and talk to police. Where we will typically get a report like that is when someone's actually been hurt as a result, or the person that's a victim of it is living in an apartment complex or an apartment house or has close neighbors who make the report to us, and then we respond.
Okay, so it's more something that if somebody has to be called or brought to the hospital, I should say, or if they're in a larger group, that you're noticing those sorts of reports.
True, that's right. Okay, just showing statistics of the property crime in Derry, and I have 2010 and forward to 2014 year to date. Again, these are figures that are as of the end of June 2014, and you see that there are thefts. You know, they go from 676, and they look somewhat stable. And then you look at 2014 year to date, and it says there's only 326 thefts year to date. And 326 is a lot, first off. But secondly, it's not necessarily representative of what's actually going on in town. The numbers with respect to burglary and stolen property seem to be a little bit different. They seem to not be increasing shockingly. However, there's more to the story, and I think it's probably very important to get out here. What has happened over the last year and a half is some of our criminals have learned how to do things a little bit differently in terms of acquiring money for things as they steal things. And the examples would be someone going into a retail establishment parking lot. We've had them stealing trash, looking for receipts. With technology as it is, oftentimes receipts now have the information of the item that was purchased specific enough for a person to pick up the receipt, go into the store, find that same item on the shelf, and then attempt to return it at the courtesy desk and get a refund. So we've had a lot of crime like that, and unless someone is caught doing that exact thing, and it's usually traced by camera, they get away with it. So it may look like thefts are going down, but in reality they're just more successful. They're getting away with it. And we've seen a lot of that recently.
And so the people who are committing these crimes are actually picking up like a receipt and going into, for example, a Walmart, picking the item up off the shelf, bringing it to the customer service desk, and then they're receiving cash, a gift card. I mean, how does that take place?
Sometimes they get cash. And a lot of the times, and you look at the bigger retailers who actually have a store card, like a Walmart as a for instance, they may give a store card because they're challenging perhaps what they see on the receipt, or the item was originally purchased with a credit card and the person that's presenting with the merchandise and the receipt now doesn't have that credit card. They'll give them a gift card or a store card. And then what happens with those cards is they get pawned. And a pawn shop will accept the card. If it's a $50 card, they may give them $30 or $40 for it. So the pawn shop now has a valid card. They're not trying to do anything illegal. They have no idea where the card came from, and it's the person who actually acquired the card in exchange for the merchandise they just stole off the shelf in that store. That's where the crime is occurring. So it becomes an unreported theft at best. Now, retailers have found a way to chase that down a little bit differently. They track things differently. Asset protection people have turned that around a little bit. I think you'll see that the reported crimes to us, the theft crimes, will increase, and the statistics will change now that everyone's kind of catching up to what the criminal is doing.
And becoming more aware that somebody would do something like that, because that's really, I don't want to say courageous, but that's certainly, brazen.
Oh, absolutely
to
brazen.
go into a store and just take something off the shelf and then walk up to the customer service desk and say, oh, I'm returning this. It's pretty obvious that you've walked into the store and over to that area.
If a store is busy enough, they may not necessarily see how that person comes into the store, but they do have cameras in a lot of locations now, and they can play it back. What we've found in arresting some of the people that have been doing these things, we've found them with a number of receipts. They'll have 15 or 20 receipts that they've picked up, and today they've gone in and tried to cash in one by taking merchandise off the shelf, and we caught them before they could use the other receipts. So it's clearly it's a well thought out plan and executed pretty well too. And our numbers here with the theft, with relation to thefts, kind of show that.
And so it looks like burglaries too, based upon your statistical data, have diminished in the last 2 years. Is there any cause or explanation for that?
Yes. In 2011, you see that's 218 burglaries. The following year was 190, and last year we had fewer. What has happened, what we've found is that we've been successful in arresting the burglars, and we find that they've done 15, 20, 25 burglaries, 30 burglaries. So what you see for a number now is representative of the fact that the person that was committing those crimes is in jail. But we've also found that there's usually someone coming right behind them to do the same things. I guess, and we haven't talked about this much yet, but the question that may arise is, how do you attribute these types of crimes to heroin addiction? And the answer is that we get to talk to these people when we make arrests, and we hear some of the crimes that they've committed, and we sometimes solve crimes that we were not aware the individual committed, but the puzzle pieces fit better once we have someone in custody, and they tell us the truth about a lot of this. And a lot of times, too, we find DNA or we find fingerprints on our person that's been arrested that we can trace back to these crimes. So we know who's doing it, and we know their current status. When we take a person into custody that's a drug addict, we try to figure out, you can usually tell they have an issue, and they will be willing to tell you they have an issue because they're going to go into withdrawal at some point in time, and they're trying to avoid that. As they get closer to that, they tell you what they're addicted to. So, you know, we know who the addicts are, so-called. Once we get them in custody, they do share that.
Right, because they start to get sick from the withdrawal, and they're, like you said earlier, when they're going through that, then they're much more openly aggressive, and I'm sure, like you said, much more willing to divulge what they've done, just as an attempt to get free, perhaps. You maybe even naming other people. Very
true, very true. And one of the other things that people in custody have done with us is they try to get out of jail by claiming a medical issue. And someone that's addicted to heroin is going to have a medical issue. They absolutely are. And they will tell us, or they'll make the claim, and we'll get them to the hospital to make sure that they get the treatment that they need. But then we also learn of the other aspects of what they're up to. It wasn't just a theft or a burglary, it's a drug addict that's committed a crime.
Okay.
There are other crimes that are related to heroin addiction as well, and these are things that we've seen, so they're not just in theory. Unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. Specifically, the addict may borrow someone's vehicle to go to the store, and then 6 or 7 hours later they haven't returned. While they didn't go to the store, they went to Lawrence, which is a typical location that we've been told by the people who are buying these things, that they've gone down to buy heroin where they can get it from, which is maybe out of state, or they've gone to another town to go get it, and they don't bring the car back. Or you have more than one person who is involved with the drug abuse, and one person representative goes out to acquire the drugs for everybody and doesn't come back. And then we get a complaint from the person whose car it was, that this person took their car without their permission or in an unauthorized way. And we find more of the story. And the last thing that I'll mention is endangering the welfare of a child. Clearly the worst of the worst when this happens, but leaving a child in the custody or supervision of a stranger because they have to go and do what they have to do, acquire more drugs, or commit a crime perhaps, or they bring the kids with them while they're shoplifting or doing something like that, or leave the child in the car while they go in and they do something. So all these things that have happened, or they get impaired to the point where they can't properly supervise a young child. We've had a few of those incidents recently where the child is left to fend for his or herself, little kids, you know, toddlers, 4 years old, 5 years old perhaps, while mom or dad is so impaired that they're unconscious. They're passed out from the effects of the drug.
We had a similar incident in Dover. It was very sad because it was a young child that was involved, and they have no way of fending for themselves. They don't understand things. They can't cook for themselves. They can't clean themselves. But the mother was so impaired that she could no longer take care of that child and didn't want to tell anybody about it. And unfortunately, it was up to the police to find out.
And the way we address these things is we notify DCYF, who is the state agency that helps with these matters, and they're helpful to us, but a lot of the time we turn a child like that over to an immediate family member, and that's the best that we can do right now, because this doesn't usually happen during the day when everybody's available and can be reached to come and help out. But certainly tomorrow that child has the same issues, because the parent or the person or the guardian is still addicted tomorrow, just like they were today. If we take a person off the street and bring them into our custody, then that child has to have a more an extended place to stay. So, we will get DCYF or others involved in that situation too, to get them placed. We talk about criminal activity, and I did mention that a lot of the time we'll catch a burglar who has been doing crime for an extended period of time, and they've committed multiple burglaries, multiple thefts, all to support the habit. And this information comes to us because we interview the arrestee, and quite often they're willing to talk once they're finally caught. Maybe they feel relief in telling us the story. But we've noticed too that their crimes don't have boundaries. A person who may commit a burglary in Derry probably will commit one in Londonderry or Windham or Auburn, the surrounding communities. So when we catch somebody, we don't just solve a crime perhaps in our jurisdiction, but we may solve crimes in other jurisdictions as well. There are no boundaries for that. And another piece of this is there are usually some funding at the state for reimbursing a crime victim or assisting a crime victim. Crime victims are not likely to be made whole here. When we catch a person that's committed multiple burglaries, say they've broken into 20 houses, we have a case pending with someone that's done that, the victim is never going to be restored for the items that we're taking from them. And some stuff you can't replace anyway. Something that's has some sentimental value or is an antique, you're not necessarily going to see that ever come back anyway. So we leave victims out there. This is the remaining victims that are family members. It's our community. These are people who may have saved up, for a year to buy their child an Xbox at Christmas, and it's gone. It's gone in a day because someone broke into the house and took it. These are the same people that we look to, though, when we try to address the overall problem with heroin addiction, and we all say, let's do something about this. We're asking those people to help, but they're also victims of the abuser.
And in an instance, like say for example, where a person's jewelry has been taken, I'm just thinking myself, that has great sentimental value. You could never replace, that pair of earrings that you got from your dad for Christmas when you were 16 years old or whatever it may be. So there's a lot that goes into that. Now, you said there's a program with the state where the victims are tried to make whole. What is that? How does that work? There
is a victim assistance fund that sometimes can help people who are victims of crime, not just this type of crime. And usually there is somebody that can help out through the county attorney's office or the attorney general's office if there are funds to do that, and they try to connect people. But you're not going to see most of the things that disappeared from your home when someone burglarized it coming back to you, nor is there going to be a fund that's going to assist you that way.
Right.
So these people will never be made whole. And the loss of that sense of security in your home when someone's broken in and done something in your home, that's very difficult to get past, and it has a huge emotional impact. We get people requesting us can you check my house, or they want to have someone stay with them for an extended period. And when you look back at the root of this, a person who was addicted to heroin wanted to take something to try to enhance or fix their immediate problem. They've created some long-lasting effects for other people. It's a huge concern.
And unfortunately, those addicts may never even remember it.
That's true.
Committing the crime, or it will never comprehend that they're taking something so important to somebody.
I'm sure that's not a consideration. We've talked to people who have committed multiple burglaries, and they've actually told us, I remember going into that house, I don't remember what I took, because they're going in maybe not necessarily completely high from the drugs, but they're affected by the drug abuse, and they don't remember. We'll find an item that's been pawned perhaps with their ID and so forth, and that's the way we connect them. But you're right, so they're not thinking consciously of what they're taking and how they're going to affect somebody. They're taking care of their immediate need, I think, in most cases. We should talk a little bit about heroin overdose, to give you a sense of what's been happening in Derry. And I've only got a couple of statistics here to share because we've had to track these differently in recent history because of the nature of the problem. 2013, we had 32 overdoses of heroin or opiate drugs, and they resulted in 9 deaths. Thus far this year, and once again, these statistics are good up until the June 30th of 2014, we've had 22 overdoses related to opiate abuse, resulting in 10 deaths. what we find is heroin abusers often abuse prescription drugs and vice versa. There's even been some suggestion in other venues that some of these people that are using heroin now and abusing heroin started with pain pills and opiate-based prescription drugs. So it's not unusual for us to see them go back and forth between heroin and prescription medications, but as you can see, the problem is ramping up significantly. 10 deaths in a year, half of a year, is pretty significant.
Yeah, opiate use is opiate use. Now, with those people that did overdose, were they mixing heroin with other things, or was it? Is there any way that we know that it was just heroin? How does that break out?
When someone overdoses, the way that we usually find out what they had is if there's any left, and then we will have it analyzed. And not every overdose, unless there's a crime charge, will that analysis be done on what it was they overdosed with. But we have been aware that heroin has been laced with fentanyl and maybe some other medications besides just heroin. People who overdose and survive aren't necessarily going to tell us what they had to begin with, and sometimes we get it from bystanders, people that were there that think that the person used a particular drug, but it's pretty much the foundation is heroin. Some of the deaths, when we do an analysis, have an analysis done by the medical examiner's office, they will come back and they'll tell us that it was heroin laced with something, and they'll be able to tell us what that is. The people who survive, we don't have that same analysis.
Are you seeing more of that in this area, the heroin laced with something else, or bad batches of heroin?
We saw in the beginning of the year the heroin with fentanyl. We haven't seen that very recently. In the last month or two, we haven't seen that.
Okay. Very scary to think about.
You know, you have to, if you can put yourself in the position of the person using the drugs, you would ask, you know, how would you even want to put something in your veins? You don't even know what really it is. You think it's heroin, and you're taking your chances every time. So the addiction is obviously very, very overwhelming and very serious for these people.
And for a lot of people who are on their, last stages, they're not just injecting it in their arms anymore. I've heard cases of people injecting it straight in their hearts or into their eyes in order to get effects.
I know that happens. We haven't seen those specific things yet in Derry, and I hope we don't. But this is a huge problem, and it's everybody's problem. And I think that really is the foundation of our meeting today in talking about these things.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of ideas of what you can do to try to help this situation if you're a person that has an idea about a person that's addicted and using heroin. If it's a family, we need them to acknowledge the fact that the abuser has an addiction. The first thing that typically happens is denial. Families will deny that there's a problem with the person, and part of that is because they don't want it to be a problem with this individual, and secondly, they're embarrassed about it. But acknowledge that there's an addiction. Try to get some help immediately. When we first started talking, people don't necessarily know where to go to get information, to get some assistance. Call us. Call the person's doctor. Call Center for Life Management, which is the mental health agency that works out of Derry. One of us will be able to give you some direction as to what to do or where to go. Don't hide the problem, talk about it. Talk about it with the person that's abusing the heroin. Talk to us, involve law enforcement, because crimes are associated with this. And back to the remark of these people need treatment, not to be in jail. Well, in reality, what happens is as they move forward with their addiction and they start committing crimes, they become criminals. That's what happens with them. So let us intercede early on, get some help early on, and try to prevent that from happening, and try to get the person help before they go over the edge. Something else that we think has been helpful is disposing of unneeded medications. We talked about the possibility that some people get started with prescription drugs, and then they move on to heroin. What we've asked people to do is, we have drug take-back days. We ask people to get rid of their unused medications. If you got some pain medication for your knee injury or your back injury and you don't need it anymore, get rid of it. Don't flush it necessarily, but we have a drug drop box at the police station, Derry. You can come in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and dispose of it there. We don't ask for any ID or anything like that. Just dump it in the box and get rid of it. And we dispose of it. There's also a drug take-back day that's done a couple of times a year, and it's done more of a statewide situation. That's an opportunity to get rid of the stuff too. But we would encourage you to get rid of it right away, and you can go to a police station like ours and dispose of it there. The next thing is to seek help from professionals. If you have a person in your family, if someone's close to you that's addicted to heroin, or any other drug for that matter, they may not be willing to go and get help. Well, nothing should stop you from trying to get help for them, or at least trying to get enough information so you know how to help them. So, reach out yourself. Don't be afraid, and don't rely on them to do that, because it may not happen. It may not happen before there's an overdose or something, or a fatality. And the last thing that I'll mention is suspicious items. And why is there a reference here for that? You may find, or you may become aware of things that are in your house that don't belong. Then they look like they might be related to drugs. I mean, a syringe is pretty conspicuous. But if you see spoons and cotton and plastic bags, they're telling you something. And you should look at that carefully. Call us, ask us the questions. We'll help you dispose of those kinds of things. But that's signs of heroin addiction, heroin use. So if you have suspicious items and you're not sure what it is, call us and we'll help you out. We'll come down and take a look.
Yeah, and heroin can be snorted now too, so I mean, maybe look for the signs of the addiction itself. People feeling very flu-like when they're withdrawing and things of that nature. If
you go on the internet and query, you'll be able to find all kinds of things that are related to drugs and paraphernalia. That's where some of this stuff comes from, but you can also find it for the purposes of preventing someone from having it. So, do your research, do the things that you can do to help. We all need to take this on a certain way, and not everybody's in a law enforcement capacity or medical capacity, but a private person can do the same things that we do sometimes in terms of trying to deter. That's find the things and try to dispose of it, get rid of it, get some help.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Captain Thomas. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to get your perspective on the issues, because you're really seeing it from a radically different standpoint than most of us who are out in the community.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everybody at home today, for watching Wellness TV. Please remember, if you are suffering from opiate abuse or misuse, if you're addicted to heroin or any other drug, including alcohol, and you need help, please feel free to reach out to others. There are many people in the community who are thinking of you and praying for you and want you to become better and get back to your old self again. Also, too, if you're a family member that is suffering because someone in your own immediate group is having an issue with drug abuse, please take Captain Thomas's advice. Reach out. There's great groups like Al-Anon. There's lots of information on the internet, and your local police department is there to help you. You don't have to worry about getting in trouble or anything like that. They really do want everybody in society to be better and make their jobs a heck of a lot easier, I'm sure. Once again, thank you so much for watching Wellness TV. My name is Kimberly Haas. Have a great day.